Do you not know that we must be here in God's holy temple? Please be seated. The Episcopal chapel at my Divinity School is far humbler than you might think. The Anglican House of Studies is in a large house about a block from the Divinity School itself. And in that house, a somewhat grand living room has been about the size of our chapter room, actually, maybe a little bit bigger, had been converted several decades ago into a small chapel. And that small chapel holds about 60 people, maybe another 15 or 20 more if you open the slide doors to the dining room. But for the most part, we kept those closed, and it was space for 60 at the most. And well, we had morning prayer every morning at 7 a.m. We were supposed to go to morning prayer every morning at 7 a.m. and then start our school day. I was pretty faithful about it, but we all have mornings where we miss it, and I would say most got there a few times a week. So we'd usually have, imagine in this small space, instead of pews, chairs like these, I have about 50 or 60 chairs, and then every morning before class, there would be about 10 or 12 of us together. And we'd say morning prayer, and then we'd go into the kind of an enclosed back porch, and we'd have coffee and donuts, the 10 or 12 students, plus whatever guests might have chosen to come be with us. And as you can imagine, a Divinity School gets a lot of guests and visiting preachers and scholars. One morning, it was a morning not unlike today, a little colder than it had been. I began to wake up for chapel, and I was feeling extra sleepy that morning. And I think I had a test the following day, so I thought, you know what? I'm going to take advantage of a little bit of extra time. I'm going to skip chapel this morning. And I remember even thinking, as we always justify as we're waking up, this must be a gift from God telling me to take a little bit of extra time and not go to chapel. Well, I found out there's kind of a buzz running around the seminary later that day, because there was someone in chapel that morning, a very slight man, gray sweatshirt, gray hair, very large ring, belonging to a man named Desmond Tutu. I slept in the morning he was in chapel. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Let this be a lesson if you're watching online. You never know what you're going to miss. You're never going to know who you missed out on having bagels with that very morning. Of course, I missed him, but he was there. And just knowing that he had been there changed that space for me, certainly for everyone who was there that morning. And he wasn't there to make an appearance. I don't even think he was visiting a preach. I think he was visiting a family friend at the seminary. But you know, by being there, his presence changed that chapel, right? He brought, the atmosphere was charged with a whole different level of holiness because of who he was. Small of build, but a giant of the church. Because of what he had lived through, how he had witnessed, because of how he, as a bishop, had used truth as a means of rebuilding a world. How he named the evils of apartheid and racism, how he was punished for that. How he even stepped into mobs of people who were going to do harm, to murder people who were believed to be informants. Bishop Tutu stepped into that mob as a way to calm the tensions. He said afterwards, I had no idea what peril I was in. Someone who was willing to put his whole body, his whole self, in the way of violence in order to keep it from happening. It changed the world, and it changed every space that he then went into. He brought with him that message of suffering and healing and a message of hope simply by walking through those doors. Though he slowed in recent years, he was 90 when he died last week, Bishop Tutu was incredibly generous with his presence. What I mean is, in the Episcopal priest world, everybody is sharing their selfies with Bishop Tutu, and who wouldn't? He visited so many places. He was visited by so many people. I know of youth pilgrimages that went to South Africa, to seminary gatherings where he was welcomed. He was always willing to be there, to put his arm around someone new, and to let his presence, let his story speak through that moment. And of course, he even preached here. When I put a note out of gratitude, and a number of people who were here the day Desmond Tutu preached from this pulpit, who were in the choir, said, I remember that day, I remember what he said, I remember how that changed this space. And it does, doesn't it? When people of that level of holiness, when people who have given their whole lives to preserving the dignity of our neighbors is in the space, we suddenly realize that we're being given a glimpse of heaven that we hadn't seen before. A member of my last church years ago, before he had gone off to medical school, had actually been in South Africa at Diocesan House. I think he must have done an internship or something like that. And he spoke of his conversations with Bishop Tutu. And he said to my friend, he said, Rob, and these are my words, I never wanted to be famous. I never wanted to be a prophet. I just wanted to be a priest. But the moments, the events, the injustice, the need to speak up, I couldn't help but speak up and lend my voice. And his ministry continued even after the fall of apartheid. It continued because poverty and corruption continued. It continued because the work of dismantling racism is never done. It continued because the work on the foundation of forgiveness needed to be laid, and it needed to be put in place intentionally and with great care and presence. Bishop Tutu was often there in those hearings, visibly crying at the painful things he was hearing, but things that needed to be said in order to rebuild. He continued his ministry because he saw the scourge of homophobia, and he saw that to be as evil as racism. His ministry continued because when Archbishop Desmond Tutu was speaking words of truth and challenge, when he was naming how racism distorts our dignity and diminishes the image of God in both the oppressor and their victims, when Bishop Tutu was delighting in the humanity of those he knew and served, he was, and I'm using the words of the gospel today, he was in his Father's house. He was in the place where he belonged. He was the place to which God had clearly called him. When Desmond was witnessing to the gospel of restoration, he was in church. And he wanted us all to come and sing with him. Now, I want to take a moment to step aside from his grace, and I'll come back to talk about the gospel this morning. A moment about the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple. Now, I actually found this to be, we don't know as much about Jesus as a child. There are some interesting lost gospels that talk about Jesus as an infant and as a toddler. They're interesting. I'll just say that. Some insight, but also some things that may not be ready for prime time. We'll have to have a forum about that one. But we do have this one story of Jesus between infancy and adulthood. And it's Jesus as a 12-year-old staying behind at the temple and his family not realizing. And I'm going to go ahead and say that there is more insight here to the 12-year-old condition than we might think, or rather to the giftedness of children and teenagers at that age, which to me helps to see just a little bit more of Jesus's humanity. So, you know the story. It's an annual trip, a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They travel together. They then leave, but Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, they travel for days before realizing that Jesus is not with them. Does that seem a little odd to you? I can't make it 5 minutes out the house without my phone, much less, oh my goodness, we've been driving for a day and our children are not in the car. What do we do? I would panic. Many of us would panic. But this tells us, first of all, that there is a different community around them, and that there is a sense that Jesus must have been raised not only by mother and father, but by aunts, uncles, cousins, friends. The whole community was raising this child. Because otherwise, how would Mary and Joseph been able to even imagine getting a day down the road? They had to have said, Jesus is in good hands because we are a village, we are a community, we travel together, and that's how we raise one another. And so they must have been fine with this until, of course, they weren't, because we're all humans, and when something is wrong, you realize you have to do something about it. So they go back and they find Jesus. But here's the other thing that I think is fascinating, and once again, I wonder why is this the age that we meet a younger Jesus? Why is this the one glimpse? Well, of course, I don't know, but I do think that there is something of this moment where the child is no longer the child. And because of that, Jesus is meeting something, some vision of holiness beyond what we can assume was a because he didn't simply say, when they found him, I'm sure it wasn't a moment of, well, I'm sure they were happy to see him, and then they were probably pretty mad, right? But Jesus, he didn't say, relax, Mom and Dad. I'm in my Father's house, so it's okay. He didn't say, I'm safe. He didn't say, I'm well cared for. He didn't say, I'm trying new things and this is fine. He said something else. He said it with what I read is a powerful sense of groundedness. He said, I must be here. I must be here. This is where God is, and this is where I need to be as well. Just as Desmond Tutu, Archbishop of Cape Town, whose people were systematically oppressed, said of the place where justice needed to be named and where reconciliation, if this was to be something godly, needed to be kindled. Bishop Tutu said, in so many ways, I must be here. This is where God is, and this is where I need to be. You know that you are in the house of God if your heart is telling you, defying all of your previous plans, despite what your family tells you you need to do, and despite what the world tells you is most important. You know what is important. You know what matters. You have learned where the voice of God is spoken, and that is where you must be. At the place where the risk is great, but the need is greater. Where suffering is real, but so too is the restoration. This is a holy place. A place of faith and hope and courage. A place where the movement of God carries us and all we love up into a new vision of our common life. This is a place of holy presence. This is God's house. And we must be here. We must be here.